Welcome to this event as part of Women at Imperial Week, which is entitled Under His Eye, Orientalism, Stereotyping and the Colonial Gaze. This event is a collaboration between Imperial College London's EDI Centre, the Imperial's One Staff Network and besea.n. My name is Pei. I'm a research associate from the Faculty of Medicine within Imperial College London, and I'll be your host on behalf of Imperial as one. I'm delighted to introduce you to Myan and King Wei from besea.n, which is the British East and Southeast Asian Network, a national non-profit organisation that seeks to promote positive representation and tackle discrimination for the ESEA community. besea.n had previously worked with Imperial's EDI Centre for a Stop Asian Hate event that was hosted in 2019 or last year? Last year, sorry. And we're really grateful to have them back this year for Women at Imperial Week to talk to us about issues that specifically affect women of ESEA heritage, both inside and outside of the workplace. This event will consist of a 30-minute presentation from Myan and King Wei, followed by a 20-minute Q&A session that will be hosted by my colleague Ada, who is a research associate from the Outreach and Widening Participation Department, and also here on behalf of the Imperial's One Staff Network. I invite the audience to post questions that they have for Myan and King Wei about their presentation using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, which is hopefully visible for all of you. Ada will be taking questions from here and not from the general chat function. Questions in the live Q&A, they get upvoted the most by the audience, will get asked by Ada, together with questions that were submitted during the registration for this event. Finally, please also remember that the session is being recorded. Myan and King Wei, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us on behalf of besea.n. I'm really looking forward to your presentation. So share your slides when you're ready.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm King Wei and I'm here with my colleague Myan from besea.n, Britain's East and Southeast Asian Network, an organisation advocating for the rights of East and Southeast Asians here in the UK. So before we begin, we just wanted to let you know that we'll be referring to some potentially triggering themes in this talk, particularly around racism, violence and murder. So please do tap out if you need to. Throughout, you'll hear us use the acronym ESEA or EC, which stands for East and Southeast Asian. The reason we want to popularize this kind of specificity is that we find the word Asian to be insufficient for a lot of purposes when navigating racial discourse in the UK. We prefer to specify South Asian, West Asian, and so on. When talking about specific ethnicities, we'll use those names. We also want to acknowledge the limitations of even the EC acronym, and that we cannot ever possibly consolidate the experience of literally billions of people across many different countries into one single narrative. We do not speak on behalf of anyone. We're here to share what we've learned and what we've experienced.
So, today we are talking about racialized misogyny, or put simply, what it means when misogyny is exacted through a lens that has an explicitly racial focus. We're especially interested in how acts of racialized misogyny exact symbolic and physical violence on ESEA women, and how ESEA women become objects under the gaze of a colonial eye. So we're going to aim to give you a high-level overview of these topics, starting with history. We'll talk briefly about colonialism, military imperialism, and the concept of Orientalism. Then the role of the media and where we see dangerous stereotypes that shape our everyday consciousness. And then the second half of the presentation, we'll look at the impact that these instruments have on ESEA women's everyday lives. So hopefully drawing a line between history and the media and real life, often very violent consequences. And finally, we'll talk about what comes next, looking at some fantastic women-led initiatives and suggesting tangible steps that we can all take with us into the future. The outcome that we're hoping for is that you'll come away with a better idea of how these tools of white supremacy operate in the world around us. And hopefully you'll be able to identify patterns and language in your everyday life much more easily. We also want to equip people with the knowledge and the tools to hold people accountable, to know when to challenge problematic behavior, or simply say no to situations that cause harm. So without further ado, colonialism. Obviously, I'm not going to condense the entire history of colonialism into one slide, but why is this important? Well, Colonialism is often framed as a conversation of what happened in the past, but contemporary anti-racism dialogues argue that it's actually very much a conversation of the present. Not only do many former colonizers maintain foreign interests in formerly colonized countries where they still hold sway today, but we still see the consequences suffered by people under hostile government policies architecture to deal with the phenomenon of post-colonial immigration, for example, such as the Windrush scandal. Colonial legacies have also shaped social attitudes, cultural tastes, and popular trends up to and including the present day. Now, women's bodies have been commodities and cannon fodder in this quest to colonize the world for centuries. So what we want you to bear in mind today as we go through our slides is this conquering colonizer mentality that views women's bodies as a metaphor for the colony itself. It's a foreign land that must be penetrated, tamed, civilized. So first of all, I want to caveat that we aren't academics who specialize in colonial history, but you don't need a doctorate to research and learn about the world around you. All of our knowledge is owed to the hard work of the writers, academics, and content creators who've walked before us, and to them, we're very, very grateful. We'll also be providing a non-exhaustive list of resources to be sent out to attendees at the end of the session. So that said, I'm quickly going to introduce the concept of the white man's burden, which you can see here on the slide in this illustration. And I want to give props to Fran Explains History for her really eloquent summary of this concept. You can follow Fran Explains History on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, pick your poison. But in short, the white man's burden comes from a poem by Rudyard Kipling, who urged the then US President, William McKinley, to invade the Philippines. In the poem, Kipling goes on to explain the burden of the white man to educate and civilize the sullen peoples. So it's really this idea of this great calling, a global mission. Now, the expression, the white man's burden, caught on, and it was used in product marketing and even government documentation of that time. And it was the precursor to the more contemporary concept that most of you probably know, white saviorism. So bearing in mind what I just said about saviorism, take a look at this image. I'm sure you can probably guess what I'm going to talk about now. Another key piece of this US military imperialism pie is its involvement in Southeast Asia to prevent the spread of communism, specifically in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Now, without wanting to be too reductive, the narrative is very much America, United States of America as the savior with its civilized technology and politics swooping in to save the poor brown people from the red wave of communism. And what I want to focus on here is the way that this conflict, known globally as the Vietnam War, has been shaped in global consciousness as an American experience in Vietnam. We call it the Vietnam War, although Vietnam has seen multiple wars in its existence. But interestingly, in Vietnam, it's more commonly referred to as the American War. But the focus in films, TV, and photography of and about the period is on American experiences, American lives, American attitudes, and US military saviorism. We can kind of see this in this very famous and widely celebrated photo on the slide by Don McCullin, where you can see a white American GI literally saving a small Vietnamese child. So I want us to think about reframing conflicts like this and valuing the voices, narratives, and experiences of Vietnamese people without denying the losses on both sides, of course. But those voices are few and far between for a number of reasons, especially in the English language. So why is this relevant when we talk about ESEA women? Well, there's a direct link between violence, military saviorism, and racialized misogyny, particularly when it comes to sex, as we will see later. Now I want to talk about the concept of Orientalism, often used in cultural and artistic dialogues, and it was introduced by the philosopher Edward Said in his 1978 book of the same name. This is the name that we give to depictions or representations of the Eastern world, positing Europe at the center, and the East as an exoticized, mystic other. Now, the societies that Orientalism denotes are often seen as uncivilized, morally abject, and critically, hypersexualized. So we should point out that this gaze can also be applied to many other Asian and even North African cultures, not just ESEA ones. But Said distinguishes between three meanings of the term. Number one is an academic tradition or field. Number two, a worldview representing the Orient in contrast to the Occident. And number three, as a powerful political instrument of domination. Now, this is really important. I believe that this is something that's very present in a lot of the media dialogues around geopolitics and identity politics even today. So where do we see Orientalism today? Well, we see this regularly where traditional customs, cuisines, dress and styles are used for marketing aesthetics, such as in this Air France campaign on the left, or the widely criticized decor and PR videos for the Ivy Asia restaurant in London, there on the right. And both of these rely on very exoticized Orientalist themes and racist stereotypes. Now, the questions that we should be asking ourselves are, who profits from these aesthetics? Do they really celebrate and show appreciation for our cultures, or are our customs simply a prop to win clout and profits, which then won't be funneled back into the communities that have been appropriated in the first place? So now we talk about the pervasive role of the media we consume. So you might recognize these stills there on the left. That's The Last Samurai. Who knew that the last samurai in Japan was actually a white man? And that's the submissive widow of the man that he murdered, who then conveniently warms his bed at night without saying very much. And on the right, we have Austin Powers and the twins Fuck Me and Fuck You. I don't have to go into detail, I hope, about how racist this is. Now, these characters straddle that classic combination of hypersexual, but also kind of weird that we often see in ESEA women on screen. Now, of course, although things are changing, there is still a discord between good and fair representation in film and media and what I'm very simply going to call negative representation. So for the latter, we frequently see ESEA women either totally overlooked. Google films about British Asians, and you'll see exactly what I mean. Or we see the opposite, so extreme overrepresentation. For an example, the website Pornhub reported that in 2019, 4 out of 6 search terms for videos featured the word Asian, and most pornography sites feature categories specifically for Asian women. Or another easy example, COVID coverage. To illustrate, I'll pass to my next slide. Now, what do all these pictures have in common? Last year, when the first reports of COVID, not last year, 2020, when the first reports of COVID-19 emerged, major news outlets reported it as the China or Chinese virus, with several images of ESEA faces used in these articles without them having any relevance to East or Southeast Asian people specifically, and certainly disproportionate to the actual percentage of ESEA people in Britain. In isolation, the image choice could be viewed as an unfortunate coincidence, but when placed all together, as you can see here, maybe we can begin to understand that the selection of ESEA people for COVID-19 reporting could be influenced by conscious or unconscious biases by these news outlets. In short, coronavirus was given an ESEA face by the global media. Now, I'd love to talk about this in more detail, but I am quickly going to touch on some of the common tropes that you've probably seen in film, TV, social media, or internet culture in general. So we have this idea of the dragon lady, the tiger mother, the more submissive, quiet China doll, and the sort of sensual Asian baby girl or ABG. Now, it's worth pointing out that these are often contested by many, and we have to account for nuance. But we do see examples of these stereotypes even in contemporary film and TV. The actress Lucy Liu, for example, has been quite vocal about her resistance to this dragon lady label that she's often typecast as. And she argues that this in itself is an attempt to marginalize her as an Asian American actress. So the conversation is obviously always nuanced, but I want you to take a look at these examples and then perhaps to start to think about where you've seen those cold, strict, emotionless dragon lady or tiger mother stereotypes, or where you've seen stereotypes of submissive, quiet ESEA women. Now, I've included the Asian baby girl or ABG trope as an example of a more recent social media phenomenon, as it's directly associated with a hypersexualized, quite sensual aesthetic that cements the connection between ESEA women's bodies, sexuality, and a male gaze. Also, I want to point out that there is a greater representation in general of ESEA women in popular culture compared to representation of ESEA men, which has its own ramifications. I want to take a moment to talk specifically about Southeast Asian stereotypes, in this case, Vietnam and sex workers, or as they're usually shown, prostitutes with no agency. So on the right, there's a stat from the musical Miss Saigon, which is a remake of Madame Butterfly. Now, Kim, the protagonist, is a sex worker who falls for an American GI. He promises to take her back with him to the States. She becomes pregnant. The plan fails. She's left behind with a child to raise. And what we're seeing is very classic lotus flower behavior. She can't speak or fight for herself. And the plot revolves around her literally needing to be saved by an American white man. And when he goes back to his real life in the States, she's left behind. And she literally takes her own life because there's no other happy ending for a Southeast Asian sex worker. And narratives like this trample over the very few stories and voices that we have from Vietnamese women during this conflict. And on the left, we have a scene from Full Metal Jacket with a sex worker who offers that famous line, "Me love you long time." Not only does the Orientalist focus on that broken English reinforce her otherness, but there's now an association between Vietnamese women and sex work in social consciousness. And we should be highly critical of pop culture references like this, especially because today Vietnamese women are one of the groups most vulnerable to human trafficking. Now, this line has a legacy that far surpasses the film itself. Countless ESEA women, myself included, have had this taunt dangled in front of them, both in situations of intimacy and in everyday conversation. There's a long history connecting masculine, militarized narratives and exoticized feminine tropes in East and Southeast Asia, found in literature as early as the 1800s. Today, one journalist at Vice found posters on the Reddit forum for the involuntary celibates subreddit, which is littered with misogynistic language and behavior, claiming that the salvation to incel rejection by women in the West lies in Southeast Asian women, particularly in Thailand. While we're talking about sex workers, it's time to acknowledge that, particularly when it comes to Southeast Asian representation, there are several intersectional factors that we should be aware of. In addition to the layers of racism and misogyny that we often see with Southeast Asian women, such as tropes about Thai mail order brides, for example, we often hear LGBTQ narratives that are fraught with Orientalism and violent fetishizing language, as well as the media's obsession with the derogatory and offensive term ladyboys, which is, according to trans writer of Burmese heritage, June Belabono, immediately associated with ridicule. Parents use us as the butt of the joke to kids. Straight men will laugh about having sex with us. Belabono writes, instead of seeing a historical higher level of gender diversity in Asian countries as something that we should aspire to, the West has been the source of an overwhelming mainstream rhetoric of derision towards trans femininity in Asia, which is also deeply entwined with anti-sex work messaging.
So we're now going to talk about the consequences of stereotyping and the foundations laid by colonial and military imperialist attitudes. So firstly, stereotyping impacts people's sense of self. As therapist Jeannie Chang explains, stereotypes are boxes that conflict you. Your identity and what makes up your identity are fluid. So the conflicting nature of a stereotype's definition and your identity strain your mental health. The role that history and the media play in imposing certain narratives on ESEA women isn't just speculative. In this next section, we've drawn on the experiences of real people today in order to highlight the particular issues they're vulnerable to. And I'd like to start off with a few facts and statistics. So a recent report by Stop AAPI Hate found that over the past year, Asian women made up 68% of the victims of anti-Asian hate crimes. The National Network to End Domestic Violence found that 41 to 61% of Asian women reported experiencing physical and/or sexual violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime, a higher rate than any other ethnic group. The Colour of Power Report 2021 found that 3 out of 1,160 most powerful people in the UK have ESEA heritage. None of them are women. In a 2019 study entitled Gender, Race and Aggression in Mainstream Pornography, found that videos of Asian or Latina women were more likely to involve aggression than those featuring white or Black women. The study also found that aggression was present in 3/4 of the videos representing Asian women, and that violence towards Asian women was most likely to be non-consensual. So I'm going to start with the realm of dating and the role racial stereotypes play in relationships. And I'm going to focus solely on the hetero male gaze here, but I think it's important to recognize that cis EC men and trans EC people are also affected by what we're going to talk about. So as far as racial fetishes go, perhaps one of the most standout examples is what is popularly known as yellow fever, a preference for EC women and albeit less commonly EC men. It has long been a well-known and well-documented phenomenon, with discussions around it regularly appearing in magazines, on TV, on the radio, and in newspaper articles over the last few decades. Consider that on urbandictionary.com, the top source for user-generated documentation of modern slang, there are no fewer than 52 logged definitions of the term yellow fever. And the popular Naughties blog, Stuff White People Like, lists Asian girls as number 11 on a list of over 100 items. EC women are all too often told that the motivations behind these preferences should be seen as positive or harmless, and it should be taken as a compliment rather than seen as offensive. We should even be flattered at the appreciation of EC women's physical beauty. So this brings me to what is coined by Robin Deng in her paper, Why Yellow Fever Isn't Flattering, a case against racial fetishes as the mere preferences argument. And it goes something like, number one, there's nothing morally objectionable about sexual preferences for hair color, eye color, and non-racialized physical traits. Number two, preferences for racialized physical traits are no different. And therefore, number three, mere preferences for racialized physical traits are not morally objectionable. Now, defenders of the mere preferences argument, and actually of sexual racism, often insist that their preferences are based purely on superficial physical attraction and nothing deeper. But what we will hopefully show in the next few slides is that even if, however unlikely, racial preferences don't stem from racial stereotypes, that does not stop these preferences from being objectionable, or that the targets of yellow fever should not feel uncomfortable or bothered in any way by them. Also, the argument is reminiscent of the colorblind racial ideology, which assumes that we live in a post-racial society where some claim that race no longer matters, thereby denying the reality of present-day systemic bias, discrimination, and prejudice. It's an ideology that centers the white experience and denies our right to feel any sort of way in the face of racism, sexual or otherwise. Additionally, in the case of EC people, this argument holds particular significance when we think about the model minority myth and our so-called proximity to whiteness. The EC community often held up, however inaccurately, as having high levels of education, achievement, financial wealth, and assimilation. EC women are the perfect marriage of having sex appeal while also holding traditional family values and a strong work ethic. This in itself could be a whole other presentation, but one of the dangers of buying into this narrative is that by design, it pits marginalized groups against each other. So in this case, pitting the docile, submissive Asian women against stereotypes of Black women as being too aggressive or politically demanding, and against stereotypes of white women who support feminist agendas for more autonomy and independence. To buy into this argument and to adopt a colorblind approach in a non-colorblind world stops you from confronting the racialized nature of certain social interactions, and it leaves you ill-equipped to deal with and process the racism you may face. If nothing else, the huge surge in anti-Asian hate crime and racism linked to COVID this past few years has proved that the model minority myth is just that. It is a complete myth. So what are some of the consequences? I can't tell you how many debates I've endured with well-meaning white men who have passionately tried to convince me that them preferring or appreciating the Asian aesthetic does not mean that they're racist, or how saying that they one day want a Japanese wife isn't problematic. Of course, they're totally uninterested and consistently fail to ask how I, as a beholder of said Asian aesthetic, feels about it all. But what if, instead of solely interrogating the possible origins of and motivations behind the racial fetish, we center the experiences of and psychological effects on those who are targeted? All women are already disproportionately judged for how well they perform against stereotypically feminine beauty ideals, rather than, say, for their intellect or ability. Sadly, there's plenty of research to show that those who fall outside of what is deemed as conventionally attractive or desirable often suffer negative impacts on their life prospects and even on their advancement in society. Women suffer disproportionate sexual harms, objectification, harassment, domestic violence, all on account of their gender. Now, while not everyone with racial fetishes may always be aware of or reflect on the historical context behind their preferences, the problematic way white Westerners view EC women in an almost entirely sexual way is well documented by academics and writers. When we think about the stereotypes present in popular culture, then add to that things like historical immigration laws, the Western military occupation of East and Southeast Asia, sex tourism, pornography. All of this leaves EC women particularly vulnerable to sexual harassment, which we'll see in more detail on the next slide. But in any case, to claim that your preferences, sexual or otherwise, developed in a vacuum, or you're somehow immune to decades worth of social conditioning through culture and through policy is frankly ridiculous. Now, what do I remember about March 2021? It had been about a year since the first UK COVID lockdown. The ni-haos and konnichiwas usually held my way on the street had slowly turned into more violent COVID-related racist slurs, which I won't repeat here today. I had been coughed at and spat at on a couple of occasions, and it seemed like every single day I was waking up to another incident of hate crime against someone who looked like me or a member of my family. Then on the 16th of March, this happened. As if the murders of 8 people, of which 6 were EC women, weren't horrific enough, I found myself become more and more angry with the details that were revealed and the things that were said in the following days. The gunman insisted that his actions were not racially motivated, that he had a sex addiction and had targeted the spas because he wanted to, and I quote, eliminate the temptation. The next day at a press conference, Captain Jay Baker of the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office, speaking of the shooter, told us that, quote, yesterday was a really bad day for him, and this is what he did. A couple of days later, FBI Director Christopher Wray agreed that the incident did not seem to be linked to race, backing up the local police, who say that he was probably instead motivated by his sex addiction. This is despite the fact that a neighboring store owner heard the shooter scream, "I'll kill all the Asians." It was the typical all too familiar, I'm not racist, but argument. And at this point, I and many others from the EC community the world over could no longer continue to listen or hide our disgust. It is everything Mayan just spoke to you about, historical colonialism and military imperialism, together with media stereotyping that leads a white man to go on a killing spree, murdering 6 EC women and 8 people in total, and then call it eliminating temptation. It is rooted in the same white supremacist thinking that allows the police and the FBI to extend the shooter their sympathy and understanding for a young man's bad day and sex addiction, prioritizing his humanity over the lives of those he killed. Now, I want to dig a bit deeper into the harmful effects of racial fetishes and stereotypes, specifically when it comes to relationships. An overwhelmingly common theme emerges when you speak to EC women about the het dating scene, exemplified but not confined to these anonymized quotes taken from various studies and conversations, which I'll let you all read through yourselves. By the time we reach adulthood, unfortunately, most EC women have experienced so many episodes like this that it becomes something we laugh about over dinner. Because if you don't laugh, you will cry. Doubt, suspicion, and consistent uncertainty. These are already common feelings when it comes to dating, especially in the early days. EC women are already subject to sexual objectification as women, but a racial fetish adds a whole new dimension of objectification that depersonalizes and homogenizes them. This racial depersonalization has the effect of treating a person as replaceable and as interchangeable with other objects. And if you think about this in the context of relationships and love, this can bear a huge psychological burden on those targeted. It's exactly in the context of intimate relationships that it actually matters to be recognized as an individual with unique and irreplaceable qualities. Women of color who already find themselves otherized by being locked out of mainstream Eurocentric standards of beauty need to expend valuable emotional energy deciphering and negotiating these doubts and suspicions as they move through their relationships. And this extends outside of just sexual relationships. In everyday life, with each racially intonated comment, negative or positive, people of color have to make decisions on whether to question it, ignore it, challenge it, discuss it with a friend, file a complaint, etc. All of which definitely takes its toll. And this very understandable insecurity can be hugely detrimental to a person's self-esteem, self-worth, and self-respect. Therefore, when we think about the mere preferences argument, at least for me, it really doesn't hold up. It doesn't matter whether or not you're racist for harboring a racial fetish, the impact still stands. Contrastly, blondes and brunettes have not suffered histories of exploitation, colonization, slavery, persecution, and exclusion on the basis of their physical appearance. Nor does eye or hair color account for discrepancies across social, economic, and political spheres, and they certainly don't affect your opportunity for health, education, jobs, or legal security. Race does. We're now going to take a couple of minutes to talk about the Isla Vista killings, because this shows us what happens at the other end of the scale when we assign genders to race. So namely, if the feminization of EC people causes EC women to be hypersexualized and increases their sexual capital, EC men suffer the opposite fate. We would like to point out that our solidarity, of course, lies with the victims of these crimes we're about to detail, and we are not justifying them in any way. We simply want to look at some of the social drivers behind acts of violence, such as Isla Vista. On the 23rd of May, 2014, a 22-year-old man named Elliot Rodger embarked on a mass murder spree, killing 6 people and injuring 14 others by shooting, stabbing, and vehicle ramming. Prior to the incident, he had uploaded a video to YouTube and emailed several contacts a lengthy description of his reasons for the attack. It became known as his manifesto. While many factors played into Rodger's motives, it's clear from his manifesto and his behavior in online forums that his mixed Chinese Malaysian and white British heritage was one of the key issues he blamed for his so-called incel or involuntary celibacy status. Rodger was convinced that Asian and Black men were undesired by white women, frequently disparaged Asian men in online forums, and lamented bitterly that having mixed heritage made him, and I quote, different from the normal, fully white kids. What we see here is an extreme consequence of internalized racism. What Rodger espoused in his writing echoes stereotypes about Asian men, including South Asian men, when it comes to their virility, intelligence, and sexual attractiveness. He literally blamed his Chinese ethnicity for his unhappiness and set out to exact revenge. It's easy to write off the Isla Vista killings as a lone individual who suffered from psychological issues and who was beyond help. And without overlooking the personal accountability for his crimes, suffice it to say that perhaps if Rodger had not felt so marginalized, so bullied his entire life, so overlooked by living in a world that prizes certain stereotypes over others, the lives of his victims, and indeed his own, might have been saved. What we are doing here is not justifying the actions of a shooter, as with the Atlanta case. We are simply interrogating the stereotypes and the popular social beliefs that both of them demonstrated in their behavior. Now, thankfully, things are changing. More and more, we see conversations opening up about mental health in both EC men and women, and we see movements celebrating our looks, our cultures, and practices, which may or may not differ from what society typically considers the default. Finally, we just wanted to pay our respects to 2 women who had their lives taken from them just this year in 2 particularly brutal acts of violence. Michelle Goh in January and Christina Lee just last month. Their deaths are tragic reminders that violence against the EC community rages on, and we must all continue to draw attention to, and in doing so, dismantle the harmful systemic values and beliefs that perpetuate and cause such atrocious crimes.
The bottom line is stereotypes are a tool of white supremacy designed to pit groups against each other, and we should be aware of the dangers faced by Black, South Asian, West Asian, Latina, Romani, or traveller women, and by LGBTQIA+ people, by migrants, disabled people, and how we can show solidarity and show up for each other. The more people who speak up and complain, the more likely we can disrupt the harmful narrative that's being played around our identity as EC people. Individual voices are very powerful when raised collectively. Now, this might look like speaking up online, sharing resources such as petitions and letters, or raising issues in community groups or safe spaces. Once we learn to spot harmful patterns of behavior and find solidarity and healing in the fact that other people notice these things too, it can give us the confidence to raise them and take them further. Furthermore, we hope that people seeing our work can feel inspired to start their own initiatives too. At besea.n, we created a website and a podcast in order to provide a platform to bring awareness on the various issues and nuances around UK EC experiences, as well as launching the UK's first ever East and Southeast Asian Heritage Month in 2021. Others have created community groups in different areas like London, Bristol, Edinburgh, as well as within companies and institutions themselves. We need to take charge of our own narratives, and we hope that it encourages more inter-community understanding and will lead to increased connection between different social justice organisations, and finally spur on further collective organising in the future. Representation is simply one small part of the picture. So to finish, we wanted to just spotlight some amazing EC organisations here led by people of marginalised genders, and we'll be sending out a list of resources to all attendees at the end, but do please check our website, besea.co.uk, for more. Thank you for listening to us. We're very, very grateful, and thank you to Imperial and EDI department for inviting us here, and we will now take some questions.
Great, thank you so much, Mayan and Kingwei, for this very rich and thought-provoking, lots of things I'm sure many of us are thinking about and have the questions in our heads. And thanks very much for people who have submitted questions as well. There are some questions that have been submitted with the registration, so prior to our setting. So our session, sorry. So let's start with one of the questions. Actually, is quite maybe we'll kind of get your presentation and how it relates to our British context. So that will be interesting. So one of the attendees asked, I'm asking this question in context of US imperialism, including its wide-reaching media influence. Are there any differences between the ESEA experience in the US and in the UK? And if so, how should the conversation in the UK be different?
Sure, I can take this one. We definitely have noticed, both from our conversations with Asian Americans or AAP, Asian American Pacific Islander people, as they like to say in the US, that there are lots of differences in our experiences. Firstly, I think in the language that we use to talk about ourselves. I think that in the UK, when we say the word Asian, it tends to mean something very different to what it means in the US. And that does lead to erasure and overlooking experience in both cases. So when we say Asian American in the US, people generally think of East Asians, maybe sometimes Southeast Asians. And in the UK, people mean South Asians, and that does lead to a kind of homogenization of experience, I suppose. But also there are a lot of, I can't go into too much detail, but there are so many kind of geographic and geopolitical elements that impact the differences in experience, and immigration is one of those. Because of US military activity, we do have kind of larger pockets of EC, well, I'm going to say Asian American, first generation and second generation or subsequent generation migrants in pockets in certain areas, like in the Bay Area or in New York. There are Koreatowns, Chinatowns, and so on. And while there are Chinatowns, for example, in the UK, the specific things, sort of policies and economic need has actually led EC communities in the UK, at least at first generation level, to be quite spread out. We see this quite often with the takeaway and restaurant trade, and this goes for most Asian migrants and immigrants to the UK. That kind of need to avoid competition leads people to spread out. Or we have policies like the refugee resettlement policy after the American war in Vietnam, where the resettlement program meant that lots of Vietnamese refugees came to the UK, but the Thatcher government deliberately put them in different places because they wanted to avoid creating quote unquote ghettos. So there are so many reasons that the conversation in the UK should be different. We have different history. We have different kind of history of colonialism. You know, our involvement in Southeast Asia is very, very different. Our involvement in Myanmar and Malaysia, Singapore is very different to what the US was doing in the Philippines and in Southeast Asia in many ways. So in a nutshell, yes, the conversations need to account for nuance, and there are many, many narratives that make up the conversations that are kind of emerging today.
Great, thank you so much, Marianne. Yeah, definitely lots of nuances and the different historical contexts and the populations and such. So thanks very much for that. I'll actually talk about one of the questions that got actually submitted before the session. So someone asked, how do we dismantle the white male gaze, which is deeply rooted in racism, as you pointed out in the presentation, that is so prevalent in the mainstream media, as you shown other examples, which perpetuates the fetishization of ESEA women. How do we dismantle this white male gaze?
Wei, do you want me to take this one, or do you want to go for it?
Oh yeah, I can go for it. So yeah, we think there are basically two parts to this. I think social media and the internet has allowed people to be a lot more vocal about what they want and they don't want. And it's a really powerful tool when it comes to news reporting. And I think it's about making our voices heard. Like, we want to see diversity. We want to see non-stereotypes, more real characters on screens. And we want to see more creators of ESEA, like creators, ESEA journalists, directors, filmmakers, content creators. And I think one nice example, and actually it's kind of relevant to a bit of news that came out this morning, is the new Disney film, Turning Red. It comes out on Friday, and it's directed by Chinese-Canadian director Domi Shi. It's about a Chinese-Canadian teenage girl living in Toronto. And like stuff like this manages to address important issues that many people from our backgrounds face without being reductive and assuming that we all have the same story. And at the end of the day, there's no substitute for experience. Like, for example, in this case, only a Chinese-Canadian second-generation person could have made a film like that. And I just wanted to bring up a bit of news that came out this morning. I don't know if you saw it, Marianne.
Oh yeah, about the film.
Yeah, so I think there was a white male film critic, an American guy, who basically watched the film and said, oh, I just think it's really alienating to lots of people. Basically, the story's not about me, so I don't get it. And just the backlash that we saw on social media about it was, yeah, just one really good example of just making our voices heard without, and I don't know, getting into cancel culture is a different kind of conversation here, but like, I think while there are many pitfalls of social media, it is a powerful tool that finally allows us to voice what we want to see, and it is making a difference.
Yeah, I think that, you know, that two-part demand, you know, we don't want to see, most people don't want to see reductive stereotypes, but also we need more creators, we need more directors, we need more people putting stuff out there. I mean, I guess we need to, that's not on us, that's a systemic problem. You know, we need more initiatives to encourage ESEA people to get into film, to get into, you know, we need to then and support the ones who do. You know, I don't think that there's that many non-ESEA people who can name more than like one or two ESEA directors, or, you know, do you know what I mean? I think that there is a level of personal what we can do, but there's a limit to that because we still need to call for, you know, greater access to programs and education and stuff that will encourage people into these paths so that they can create stuff that, you know, responds to a need that's definitely there.
Yeah, definitely. Great. I'm trying to cram in as many, I know because of quite a lot of questions, people, you know, very good questions, you know, touch on different aspects of your talk and related subjects. So this one, maybe you can just give a brief answer. This is a pre-submitted question, actually kind of relates to the last question. So it's asked, how can ESEA women celebrate their beauty and sexuality without falling into the Orientalist tropes that may look like it's done to appeal to the colonialist white male gaze?
Yeah, This is a really interesting question. Sorry, Maya. Shall I just...
No, go ahead.
So I think there's a real power imbalance here. I personally strongly believe it shouldn't at all be about us policing our own bodies in order to change the white male gaze. I mean, if history has taught us anything, it's we can police the way we talk and behave, and it's just really not going to make a difference. So it's really more about changing the way others judge and evaluate us against whatever cultural stereotypes and benchmarks they already have in their head. But additionally, it's kind of also about the freedom of choice. And I want to just give an example here of cheongsams and wearing cheongsams. So for me personally, I have this really beautiful cheongsam that I got made for a friend's wedding last year, and I love it so much, and I've worn it at the wedding and just that one time. For me, I would just feel so uncomfortable to wear it in a public place in this country or in any white dominant country. I just feel uncomfortable at the thought of like being seen in a certain way or what people would think. It just worries me. But at the same time, I know plenty of people who would happily wear a cheongsam out in public, and that's something I'd really love to do one day. But it's not, I have, you know, the right to make the choice not to, just as people have the right to make the choice to wear it. And yeah, so while we shouldn't be policing our bodies, we should also have the choice to say no, and because we just live in the reality of and under the white male gaze, which is a very strong and powerful force. So yeah, we should basically be able to do what we want without any judgment. I think that's what it comes down to at the end of the day.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, definitely. I think I'll take one of the questions actually from from one of the audience here and take a slightly different direction. So the question is, I've seen a lot of discourse around anti-Blackness racism in the Asian community. I think many of us within the community acknowledge, you know, that knows that it's happening, and likewise racism against Asians in the Black community. How can one overcome these barriers, which have, in my opinion, the person submitted this question, been erected by white supremacy to bridge the Asian and Black communities or other minority ethnic communities together?
Sure. So I assume that what the person who posed the question is referring to is that there was a spate of recent, semi-recent violent physical attacks on Asian Americans in the US that were often perpetuated. The people who carried them out were African Americans. And unfortunately, what we saw was a lot of horrible backlash on both sides, especially on social media, that wonderful cesspool that we know as social media, especially on Twitter. And I want to say categorically that there is literally never any excuse for racism. So even if things occur in the conversations that we have about those issues and the drivers behind them, we shouldn't be playing what some people like to call oppression Olympics or whataboutism or whatever it is to try and justify our pain. We can hold space for the fact that EC communities and Asian communities around the world are feeling a kind of collective grief for something that's happening without overlooking the very real struggles that Black people face all over the world. And there's certainly nothing that justifies using anti-Blackness in our language, which we all know, of course, I hope. But how do we, first of all, so how do we get past this? And that is by, I personally am not interested in having any conversations about, community building with people who aren't willing to speak openly and kindly to one another. I have had plenty of conversations with people from Black communities who share our pain, who share our collective grief, who've had their own experiences that are very different for a number of reasons, but that allow them to empathize. And I've said this many times. In my personal experience, there is no community kind of more patient and more able to hold space than Black women. And there are plenty of opportunities for us to have these conversations. It's just about finding the right places and times to do it. And, we at BC, we've certainly found that collective organizing and change can really come after the healing has happened. You can't just go in and change things when you've got all this stuff happening in your head. You know, racism takes its toll on you throughout an entire lifetime. It's a buildup, it's a fabric of all of these things that happens. And anybody who has been marginalized, whether that's because of their race or whether that's because, you know, they're disabled or their gender or sexuality, or whatever it is, those things build up. And I do think that creating spaces of kind of shared collective healing and sort of allowing ourselves these nice safe spaces to be vulnerable together then leads to the kind of constructive conversations about what we can do. I don't think anyone going in guns blazing and saying, oh, this person did this and this person did this and our people are suffering, well, ours are suffering more, is going to help anyone.
I totally.
Somebody's also just mentioned in the chat about speaking about anti-Black racism among ESEA communities and vice versa. Definitely, like I said, no one is exempt from having conversations about racism. I think that many of us may have had to have uncomfortable conversations with family members or with people who are close to us about things they shouldn't be saying. You know, I know that there are, you know, I've got friends who are Black who've also had to have uncomfortable conversations with their family members about how they talk about EC people or about Asian people in general. Sorry, Kingwei, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I completely agree. Like, while it's important for us to heal within our own communities, I'd really like to see more of the next stage happen where we learn from each other. I think we have a lot to learn from the Black community. Obviously, their history is very different from ours, but I think we have a lot to be thankful for from the Black community and a lot to learn from them. And recognizing we share a common enemy, white supremacy, is key in all of that. I also do some work with EC Sisters, and late last year we held a healing event with Black Minds Matter, and it was so nice to be able to be in a room together with the Black community and talk about some of these issues we talked about openly. And I think really that is the next step in dismantling white supremacy, is working together on it.
Great, thank you so much, both of you. I know, like, we're kind of running low with time, so I just want to address a couple of things in the Q&A. I know a couple of questions are asked about resources and things, you know, so hopefully we can, we'll look at those, and then I think we'll have a follow-up email and with resources and links and such, so hopefully we can address some of those. But maybe quickly, with probably one of the last questions, we're running out of time. Linking to actually what you just said, a bit of wider population. So one of the pre-submitted question asked about how can white friends, well, I would say even just any other maybe non-EC people, friends, or better support their Asian friends through this time. And the person said, it's been so hard on many of my friends, but I feel at loss for what to do or what to say and help them personally.
Yeah. So I assume that this question comes from quite a personal place. So I'm very, very sorry that your friends have been, you know, going through a really hard time, and that it's really great to see that you want to help them. Just on the kind of what kind of white friends can do in general, I spoke to Stylist magazine a few months ago and put together a kind of list of actual concrete stuff that people can do without burdening their friends, just to kind of stay involved in conversations and know what's going on, or ways that you can give money, or things that you can do, you know, organizations that you can get involved with, or things you can read, and things like diversifying your bookshelf and being a more mindful consumer. So that is available online. We can find the link for you. Either someone from BCN will drop it in the chat here, or we can make sure that it goes out with the resources that can be sent out at the end. But from the kind of very interpersonal level, silence hurts. So we do appreciate check-ins. You know, after the Atlanta shooting last year, my best friend, who is white, and obviously doesn't, you know, she doesn't know how it feels, but she knew that obviously something really terrible had happened. She sent me a plant with lovely red flowers on it, and she didn't want to talk about it. She didn't ask me to explain how I was feeling or explain the impact this was going to have on the community, because that is something that some people do when they check in. They say, hey, you know, I know this stuff is going on. It sounds really horrible. So what do you think about this? And they want you to kind of give your opinion and all this stuff that's really quite traumatizing. So basically, communicate without expectations. You know, you can provide comfort without the expectation of like analysis or conversation or explanations, because you obviously could be doing that on your own and the person isn't there to like validate your feelings. But also like share the joy. Don't just, you know, I'm sure that if you have Asian friends, you're probably already doing this kind of stuff with them, but like we want our friends to be there for the non-racism stuff too. You know, we want our friends to come out to our favorite restaurants, or like maybe even come over to our houses to learn to cook certain things. I mean, you know, you can also indulge yourself, you know, try new restaurants, go learn how to do new things, learn about new traditions. Like maybe you've developed a penchant for, you know, historical fiction from Southeast Asia. I don't know what it is, just sharing the joy as well.
I'm so happy when my white friends wish me a happy Lunar New Year. I still get so much joy from that. And come to ESEA Heritage Month, come with us.
I agree. Yes, that definitely means like something like, oh yes, they recognize this. But well, I understand that, you know, we're pretty much running low on time with the Q&A. I see Paige coming on for a closing session. Just want to thank very much for answering. I'm sorry, everyone. I know we got so many, quite a few other questions, great questions that we can't address this. So, but yeah, but thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you, Ada, so much for hosting the Q&As. There have been loads of questions. It's lovely to see so much activity in the live Q&As, having on top of the submitted questions during registration as well. It's fantastic. Everybody wants to engage in this conversation. And like Ada said, there's so much more that we can talk about, but unfortunately we are limited to 1 hour. So for now, I just want to say thank you again to Mayan and Kingwei from besea.n for their really excellent presentation and answering all the questions from the audience. It means a lot to me personally as a British-born Chinese woman to see besea.n come into existence in the last couple of years. I never imagined as a kid that something like besea.n would be there for me. So thank you so much. And I really look forward to watching this organization grow, and thank you for setting it up and keeping it running. It's absolutely amazing as an organization. And I really hope we get to work together again at some point. I also want to thank Moon Lee and Cynthia, who've joined me on screen. Moon Lee is from the People Organizational Development Center and also part of the Imperial's One Staff Network, and she's been helping to co-organize and moderate this event, so thank you. Cynthia, who's amazing, from the Imperial EDI Center, along with Kaltner and Sheena. Thank you so much for setting this up and coordinating it. There's been a lot of work that's been put into this, and I'm really grateful. Most importantly, all of us are very thankful to the audience for attending and interacting with us this afternoon. We really hope that you found this event helpful, and we're glad you came to connect with us in this conversation about life of ESEA women. We're always looking for ways to engage in conversations about what it means to be part of the ESEA community, both in the academic environment and beyond. So look out for more events like this one, and I really do hope there will be more events like this one. But for now, please visit our websites, find us on Twitter, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Bye.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.